I'd like to welcome you to Module 4 of Ethical Hacking Essentials. In this module, we're going to look at password cracking techniques and countermeasures. We have 5 different sections to look at in this module. Number 1 is going to be looking at the password cracking techniques in general, and what about password complexity? We're going to be looking also next in section 2 at Microsoft authentication. Why Microsoft? Well, because it's one of the most popular ways of doing authentication. After that, in section 3, we're going to look at the various types of password attacks. In section 4, we're going to look at password cracking tools. And last, we're going to look at countermeasures against password cracking attacks. All right, let's jump on into it. Number 1, password cracking techniques. So there are many different password cracking techniques. The goal is to take the password that the user is using and discover what it is, and then use that account, recovering the password from the computer system, using the password to gain unauthorized access, and they're going to take advantage of weak passwords or easily guessable passwords. One of the most important items to consider with a password is the idea of password complexity. So passwords, they contain letters, special characters, and numbers, and the more complex they are, the more difficult they are to crack. If they only contain numbers, then they are pretty easy to crack. If the password contains only special characters, that's it, that also makes them easier to crack. Passwords that contain letters and numbers only, and they're short, they can be easier to crack. If they contain only letters, they can be easier to crack, or only letters and special characters. At least we diversify a little bit, right? Have a couple of different ways of doing things, or maybe only special characters and numbers. The more you limit complexity, the more your password becomes easy to crack. One of the other things that I want you to think about is what's called password entropy. And in fact, what I'd like you to do right now is open up a tab to DuckDuckGo or Google and type in the following search phrase: password entropy, E-N-T-R-O-P-Y, and then the term XKCD. So password entropy, XKCD. If you do that, the first or second, I think it's the first choice, you'll see XKCD. XKCD is a comic for geeks, people who like technology, etc. The comic that you'll see, the last panel says something about a horse battery staple. Now, what this discusses is what's called password entropy. So irrespective of whether you have password complexity or not, if your password is short, 5 characters, 8 characters, then it has low entropy, and it's very, very easy for a computer system to crack. If your password is a passphrase, even if it has less complexity, then it has higher entropy, and it takes computer systems longer to crack. So that password complexity is important, but a short password, like every one that you see on this slide, has very low password entropy, and modern computers can crack those short passwords, even with high complexity, with a brute force attack. So one of the other things that we want to keep in mind is authentication, Microsoft authentication. In particular, the SAM, the SAM is the Security Account Manager database. And if you have a standalone computer system, your SAM passwords are stored in a hashed version using NTLM authentication or NTLM hashes on that system. And so what you want to do is a couple of things. Number one, like we said, that Windows stores passwords in the SAM. If you have an Active Directory database, the storage of those passwords is a lot safer because it's part of a domain. They're not stored in clear text. They're hashed, but those hashes are fairly easy to crack. Also, if you're using NTLM authentication, which if you don't have your computer system on an Active Directory domain, very likely you'll be using that for certain transactions. The NTLM or LM authentication protocols produce hashed passwords that are fairly easy to crack because they're stored in that SAM database using different hashing methods. So what you really want is to have your workstation integrated into an Active Directory domain using the Active Directory database, using Kerberos authentication, which is the default authentication protocol when you are using Active Directory, which is way stronger than peer-to-peer authentication using NTLM. So if you're on a network, let's say that you have a small business, and your small business, let's say you only have 5 people working for your organization, and everybody has individual logins. Each of those workstations is vulnerable to attack. Even if you have a small business of 5 people working at your organization, it's better to go get yourself a Windows Server 2022 or 2019, depending on the year that you're listening to this, and create an Active Directory domain and have your computers log in on the domain and lock out that low-level password that you get in the SAM from a standalone computer system. So there are many different types of attacks. There are non-electronic attacks. Someone just looks over your shoulder. Or maybe they have binoculars or a telescope and they're looking from one office building into another, watching you type. Or maybe they're hacking your brain. That's right, Human Operating System 1.0. Largely unpatched, never upgraded. Also dumpster diving, where people throw things away that they don't consider to be important, but an attacker can use that. So those are some non-electronic, but then there are electronic attacks, which are active online attacks, where the attacker does a direct attack using brute force or dictionary techniques. Dictionaries. If you go online and you look for password dictionaries, you can find password dictionaries that are over a terabyte in size. And this is actually pretty interesting because these are text files, meaning that there are billions and billions of passwords in these text files that can be used for dictionary attacks. Brute force attacks will take every possible combination. Now, I want to tell you that brute force attacks are difficult to do because they take an extraordinary amount of 2 things. Number 1, computer resources, and number 2, time. And when I say an extraordinary amount of time for a brute force attack, I'm talking about enough time that every star in the universe will have evaporated. Right? So I don't know about you, but I normally don't wait around billions of years for things to happen. Normally I like it to happen in less than a few billion years. You know, I just don't have that amount of time. In fact, for a long passphrase, it can take more time than you could get in 20 universes. I mean, brute forcing can take a long time, but there's a caveat. The caveat is those brute force techniques are using modern computers. There's a new class of computer that is not just advancing in a linear fashion, not just advancing in an exponential fashion, but it's advancing geometrically. So it's going to sneak up on you, and that is quantum computers. A quantum computer, rather than examining one item at a time, let's say that there are 10 billion items, rather than in examining one atom at a time, a quantum computer examines all items simultaneously, which allows it to do a lot faster. So eventually, you're going to see quantum computers used in brute forcing attacks. All the more important to make sure that you have your authentication ready for the future. It's not just quantum computers that we're worried about. We're looking at AI issues, deep learning issues, and so on that are making passwords more and more the target of attacks. There are those who say that we are seeing the end of passwords. Surely we are seeing the end of passwords as the only way to get into a system. Rather, what we're seeing is a password along with a biometric, along with a dongle or something like that. So multi-factor authentication. So just a little zoom out on the implications of brute force. A rule-based attack is one where you know one of the rules that makes up the password. Hash injection is when we inject a known hash of a password. One of those would be LLMNR, MBTNS poisoning, where you have a lab that you can try that out. There are Trojans, spyware, keylogger, and even guessing the password, which hardly ever works. And there are other types of password attacks, including passive online attacks. And these are where you are logged into a network, or you're somehow on the network, not necessarily logged in, but you're able to run a sniffer like Wireshark and do wire sniffing, or even run a man-in-the-middle attack. A replay attack is when you take the information that you discovered through sniffing and you play it back to the resource that the user was using to see if you can get in. And most of these wire sniffing, yeah, you can get a lot of information. Man-in-the-middle attacks, yes, there are many different ways to do those, but replay attacks don't usually work very well. And then there are offline attacks where you take the information, take the list of password hashes, and then you use pre-computed hashes in rainbow tables. A rainbow table is like a dictionary file, but it's just the hashes from the passwords that you would find in a dictionary file. And then you can take those and you can even use a distributed computer program to help speed up the attack, or even upload the hashes and run distributed computing in the cloud, AWS or Azure. So I've mentioned a few terms, and we want to make sure you understand what they are. Number one, I've mentioned dictionary. So like for instance, if you go to a tab, go to DuckDuckGo or to Google, and you do a search, and the search would be top 1,000 passwords, top 1,000 passwords. Or if you want, you could do top 100 passwords, and you'll see a list of passwords, everything from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to Dallas to people's names, etc. So those are some of the top files that, for instance, you'd find in a dictionary file. But then you'd also have not to the top 100, not to the top 1,000, but the top 100,000 or the top million or even more. And so what happens is the dictionary of commonly used passwords, passphrases, etc., and also compromised passwords will be used against the resource that the attacker is trying to attack. But we also have brute force attacks. I was talking to you about that and the possible future role of quantum computation in brute force attacks. And with brute force attacks, what you're doing is you're taking every possible combination of characters. That right now, with current computers, that can take so much time that you might have to just sit on a rocking chair and wait through like 4 or 5 universes. And then there are rule-based attacks. With rule-based attacks, you have some information about the password. So for instance, let's say that an employee has an employee badge. the password is the first 5 digits of the employee number dash some password. And if that's the case, the attacker would say, oh, hey, I know the first part of every password of this organization. So all I have to do is figure out the second part, because there is a rule. So a rule is some type of information about the password that happens with every password. The next type of attack is password guessing, and that's kind of difficult to do. Really, this only happens in movies when the group of young people who are trying to break the system are quickly trying to guess a password, and they finally look around in the cubicle and they see the guy with his dog Fido, and they say, oh, and they type in Fido. And for some reason in the movies there's always like these weird clicking noises and beeps whenever you use a computer. What's up with that? Anyway, they type in Fido and they quickly download the information and they're able to escape at the last minute. That only works in the movies. There are so many combinations of passwords that just guessing them doesn't work. I mean, you can create a list of possible passwords, you can do high, low, but it just doesn't work very much. Failure rate is high, right? So, you know what? It's even hard to guess your own password. If you forget your password for a device or for a network or whatever, and you try, oh, what did I change it to? I changed it on Friday and it's Monday and I can't remember, and you try all these different combinations and you still don't get it. It's your own password. It's even more difficult guessing somebody else's passwords. Remember when I was telling you that you could do an internet search and type in the term default passwords? Well, here it is. These are some of the sites that you found if you did that. Open Sesame, default passwords, CERT, defaultpasswords.us, default-password.info. These are some of the sites you would find. And you, like I was saying before, you can sort by a manufacturer and find the default passwords of that manufacturer and then use them in an attack. Trojan, spyware, keyloggers, we're already talking about that in the previous module. And how does that work in terms of passwords? Well, first thing that happens is the attacker is going to get to this system. See, look, it has a bug on it already, so we know they got it with a Trojan or spyware or a keylogger. And then the next thing that's going to happen is the victim is going to log on to a server with their credentials, some resource with their credentials. Well, what's going to happen after that? Well, the keylogger can see exactly what they typed. You get that information back, and then the attacker uses that info to log in also to the same server. Now, that is a little bit difficult with a domain controller in a Windows network because the attacker's computer would have to be part of the network. But the attacker might be able to gain control or gain physical access to this computer. There are so many ways to do this if you have spyware, Trojans, or keyloggers. So that's how you can gather passwords. This is the way attackers often gather passwords, is to have one of these three pieces of malware on the system. There's also the idea of a pass the hash or PTH attack, often known as a hash injection attack. And what's going to happen is this deals with password systems that exchange hashes. And so what happens is there's going to be a compromised hash that's injected into a local session between somebody and their network. And then the hash is going to be used to gain access to validate network resources, extracting the domain account hash, and eventually logging onto the domain controller. So if you look at the steps that happens, so here's an unsuspecting user, taps on that keyboard, logs in, log hashes, the hashes are stored. This is a server, not really a domain controller, because a domain controller would be something that is running Kerberos, and Kerberos does not do hash exchanges like this. But it could be an old school domain controller, like from NT40 or something like that. So either way, it's some type of service that the user is logging into There are ways of doing this with domain controllers also, but there has to be certain existing conditions to make it happen. In fact, with the LLM&R, MBT, and S poisoning, that is done on a domain. So either way, the next thing that happens is the attacker is going to use some type of local or remote exploit to compromise the server. So like I was saying, there has to be some other part to it. In this case, there's a compromise of the domain controller. And now what's going to happen is the attacker is going to extract the domain admin hash, and then they're going to inject that hash into the session that this user has, and then use that to attack the network assets of the domain of this service. So we have pass the hash, and I was already mentioning LLM&R, MBT, and S. And this is a link local multicast name resolution is what this is, and it uses multicast to help resolve the names of hosts on the network. And NBT and S is NetBIOS, and that NS is name server. So NetBIOS name server is when you have a Microsoft system that's running their old NetBIOS, NetBEUI networking that was created back in the early 90s, late 80s, actually early 90s, and it is extremely vulnerable. And so when we talk about remediation, we'll talk about how to not be vulnerable to LLM&R and BTNS poisoning. So in this case, what's going to happen, and by the way, when you go to iLabs and you run this lab, don't get fooled, because there's a part of it that some people get stuck at, and it's actually part of the lab. And so what happens is the user, well, the first thing that's going to happen is the attacker is going to have a listener that they install that is looking for people who are logging in, right? So the user then is going to send like a host name, whack whack, that's the saying I want to get to a specific server, right? So the listener is already on there listening for LLM&R, MBTNS broadcasts, and then when that broadcast happens, the LLM&R, or I could just say the LN poisoning, or something like, to make it shorter, it poisons it, and it sends a data server not found to the user. But literally what happened in the meantime is the attacker was able to accept the NTLMV2 hash of this user, and then they have the hash now of that password. And then what the attacker does is uses a cracking software like John the Ripper to crack that hash and reveal the password, and then they can log in to the network later on as this user. The part of the lab that you have to look out for is when you type in the resource and you get an error. I've had a lot of students stop there and say, oh, this isn't working, I got an error. Well, that's a fake error. That was an error sent by the attacker to capture that information from the user. There's another type of attack that we've kind of talked a little bit about, pass the ticket. So we have pass the hash. We have LLM&R, MBT, and S. Yeah, I've said that a lot of times. It's easier for me to say it. Pass the ticket. In this case, it's an authentication attack. And this is actually used to attack Kerberos. And so it's for authentication systems using Kerberos without providing the user password. So what happens is the attacker dumps Kerberos tickets of legitimate accounts. There are these credential dumping tools that you can use. Mimikatz is probably the best tool for this type of attack. The attacker then launches that pass the ticket attack by stealing the STTGT, that's a ticket granting ticket, from the end user machine, or stealing that ticket granting ticket from a compromised authorization server, which is a Microsoft domain controller. And then the attacker uses that retrieved ticket to get access to the network services that they're after. And so tools like Mimikatz, Rubius, even Windows credential editor are used for these types of attacks. So this is a pass the ticket. So pass the ticket used to attack the ticket granting ticket capabilities of Kerberos in a Microsoft Windows domain controller environment. Next, we look at wire sniffing. Wire sniffing is when you employ a sniffer to get sensitive information from unencrypted transactions by just watching what goes across the wire. There's another one, man in the middle. In replay attacks with a man in the middle attack, there's an original conversation between two hosts, host-to-host communication, and maybe the user is on a web server. And what happens in this case is the attacker sniffs that communication, is able to do something like, for instance, predict session tokens, or maybe they're able to compromise cookies, or either way, they extract the relevant information from those tokens and they take control of that communication, blocking off that victim, and they are now in the middle of that communication talking to that host. It's relatively hard. You have to be on the inside. You have to be trusted on one or both sides of the network. And so you can, a lot of times you have to actually it can be broken by invalidating that traffic of the attacker, because it is actually invalid traffic. We've mentioned this before. The next one, rainbow table attack. It's like a huge collection of passwords, but it's not the passwords, it's the hashes to the password. And rainbow tables have those hash values of those passwords. We compare the hash to the legitimate password by just comparing all those hundreds of thousands or millions of hashes against the hash that the attacker obtained from what's being attacked, and then you can recover it. Also, that hash comparison is actually pretty fast. So these are some of the pre-computed hashes, and run it on a rainbow table attack, and boom, an attacker can gain access to login information. All right, so now we are moving into the second section, looking at some of the tools that can be used for password cracking. All right, number one, loft crack and off crack. Loft crack used to be the preeminent tool, and it eventually got purchased and spun off, but now it's actually still pretty cool, but you have to purchase it. It's great for auditing and recovering applications. Off crack, though, is completely free, open source, graphical. You create a little like a USB flash drive, DVD or CD boot disk, and you can use it to recover Windows passwords on a laptop or desktop. Rainbow crack, very nice tool used to crack hashes with rainbow tables. So it actually has a really cool little algorithm using a time memory trade-off to try to make it much faster at cracking password. These three right here, John the Ripper, Hashcat, and THC Hydra, very nice tools I've used many times. The Medusa is actually nice too. You have used that a lot less than THC Hydra, Hashcat, or John. The reason I call it John is because in your Linux box on your lab, you'll see that the command that you use to access John the Ripper is just the word John, right? So very usable tools for cracking passwords on any type of system.